On the 1st of May 1820, Arthur Thistlewood, Richard Tidd, James Ings, William Davidson and John Brunt were hung from the neck and their heads posthumously cut off with a surgeon's knife. It was May Day, a day that would, in years to come, be recognised as a celebration of workers' rights. In 1820, however, it marked the final act of a failed plot to assassinate the Prime Minister and his cabinet. This plot is known as the Cato Street Conspiracy, named for the place the conspirators gathered on the night of their intended coup. The plan to kill the cabinet had been formed by ultra-radicals, spurred on by the violent suppression of peaceful protesters at St. Peter's Field in Manchester the previous year, and the oppressive 6 acts rushed through Parliament in the months that followed. These acts banned meetings of 50 or more people, banned citizens from performing military drills, imposed a high stamp duty on radical pamphlets, and gave magistrates the power to search for arms. Now, January 1820 was a tense and uneasy time. The King, George III, had died, the radical press had been effectively gagged, and many of the radical leaders were in prison. For Arthur Thistlewood and his co-conspirators, now was the time to strike at the heart of what they deemed the corrupt political establishment. Thistlewood was already known to the authorities. He was a member of the Spencean philanthropists, followers of the late Thomas Spence, who had called for the common ownership of land and radical political and social reform. In 1816, the Spenceans had organised 2 mass meetings at Sparfields in London. The first went off peacefully, with Henry Hunt addressing the crowd and being elected to deliver a petition calling for reform to the Prince Regent. The second, however, ended in a riot and an abortive attempt by an armed band led by Thistlewood to seize the Tower of London and to spark a revolution. Thistlewood was arrested and charged with high treason, although on this occasion he was acquitted. But by 1820, Thistlewood had changed his strategy. Rather than attempting to create a mass uprising that would sweep away the old regime, he would strike directly, cut the head off the government, and use the shock of that act to bring about a revolution. The arrest warrant signed by Robert Baker on the night of the failed assassination names Thistlewood and 13 co-conspirators. Amongst those listed were John Brunt, James Ings, George Edwards, Robert Adams, Richard Tidd, James Wilson and William Davidson. Now, Robert Adams testified against his co-conspirators to escape his charges, and it is from his testimony that we can piece together much of what happened in the months and the days leading up to the planned assassination on the 23rd of February 1820. The Spenceans had been watching and following cabinet ministers for some time, looking and waiting for an opportunity to strike. But this opportunity presented itself when one of their members, George Edwards, shared the intelligence that the cabinet would be meeting for dinner at the home of Lord Harrowby, President of the Privy Council, in Grosvenor Square on the 23rd of February. On hearing the news, James Brunt proclaimed, "I have often prayed that he would bring all these thieves together in order to destroy them. He has answered my prayer." The plan was to behead the cabinet ministers, including the hated Lord Sidmouth and Castlereagh, display their heads on poles and parade these through the slums of London to whip up support. Amidst the uproar that would follow, the conspirators expected other radicals to join them in seizing power. Thistlewood had even drafted a series of statements to be published after the assassinations. In one statement addressed to the people, he wrote, "Your tyrants are destroyed. The friends of liberty are called upon to come forward. The provisional government is now sitting." The hayloft at Cato Street was selected as their meeting place, given its proximity to Grosvenor Square, and James Ings, a butcher by trade, was selected to carry out the murders. He planned to say, "I have got as good men here as the Manchester Yeomanry. Enter, citizens, and do your duty." This was, of course, a reference to those responsible for the Peterloo massacre. But what Thistlewood and his co-conspirators hadn't realised was their group had been infiltrated by the authorities. Edwards, who had been present at Sparfields, had become a government spy in 1818. His intelligence of the cabinet meeting was a lie fed to him by his Home Office masters, designed to flush out the ultra-radicals. Edwards had already supplied the conspirators with arms and money. On the night of the 23rd, the Bow Street runners lay in wait for the unsuspecting plotters. At around 8:30, the police stormed the loft. William Davidson, who had been charged with keeping watch, called out, giving time for 4 of his co-conspirators to escape, including Thistlewood, who had fatally stabbed policeman Richard Smithers in the ensuing chaos. These men too were eventually arrested in the following days, with Edwards leading the authorities straight to Thistlewood's bolt hole. The trials of the conspirators, 11 of whom were charged with high treason, were highly publicised, with Robert Adams and John Harrison turning on their co-conspirators and aiding the prosecution in return for leniency. Thistlewood, Davidson, Ings, Tidd and Brunt were all sentenced to death, whilst the others were sentenced to transportation. William Davidson, a British Caribbean who was the son of an Attorney General and a Jamaican woman, cited the Magna Carta in his defence, arguing that if those in power infringed the rights of the people, as set out in the Charter, the people were to be called together to take up arms and assert their rights. Such an act was not considered in olden times an act of treason against the king, but the execution date arrived. Thistlewood declared that he would die a son of liberty, whilst Ings cried, "Give me death or liberty," and Brunt declared, "It is better to die free than live as slaves." Davidson, however, muttered prayers, almost to the moment of his death. After hanging for half an hour, the men were drawn down, decapitated, using the surgeon's knife. And despite a petition to Lord Sidmouth on behalf of the men's widows requesting their remains be returned for burial, the mutilated bodies of the Cato Street conspirators were buried in quicklime at Newgate Prison. In the aftermath, the radical MP Matthew Wood accused the government of entrapment and launched a campaign to prove that the government spy George Edwards was behind the plot. Edwards was acquitted of all charges, but Wood's call for an inquiry forced him into hiding and finally exile in Cape Colony, South Africa. Although Thistlewood had hoped to be remembered as a martyr for the radical cause, the Cato Street Conspiracy arguably gave the government more agency to clamp down on calls for reform. The plot was the very evidence they needed to show that popular radicalism was lawless, dangerous, and unpatriotic, an image later reformers like the Chartists would be at pains to dispel. However, the conspiracy did not prove fatal to the cause of reform. As Ted Vallance writes, the Cato Street trial also revived concerns about the use of spies and agent provocateurs, which played well to the pro-reform members of the middle class.